Some people kind of go more with the flow in terms of their prep time, but this is generally something that requires a lot of practice, and especially if you speak with one teammate very consistently, this is something that is certainly going to up your game in the debate very well if you have a very good prep time routine in place, or you know all of the things that you're going to do in prep time. So what is the structure of it? And in essence, also the structure of this workshop. So generally, in the 15 minutes that you are given in BP, I generally always start with brainstorming for 2 or 3 minutes, both of us individually with our partner, just coming down, noting down any ideas we get about the debate. Then we're generally discussing what we talked about and deciding on the case that we want to run, deciding on the arguments, very briefly outlining the case we want to do. Then we generally move on to things such as plan, characterization, framing, all of the more general things you need to talk about to set up the debate. And then go to a more detailed case making as the last part of it. And as you can see from the minute allocations, I would say that you probably have less, I generally at least tended to leave less time for like detailed making of arguments, but rather left more time for deciding on the case, deciding as a whole on how we see the debate is going to play out, as we believe that is the most important part of essentially prep time and how you can predict the debate, especially if you're not in opening government and therefore cannot, let's say, do all parts of debating or of the debate. You cannot plan all parts of the debate already in your head. So detailed case making usually means coming up with arguments and mechanisms, coming up or thinking about the opposition case, thinking about rebuttal, and finding holes in the arguments that you have made together with your partner. So this is the broad structure of how I would generally go about in prep time. Sometimes it's more fluid, but this is roughly what I would say I just instinctively do. I will now take you through all of the different parts that I have outlined here and give you some tips on how to do all of these things better. So firstly, how to go about brainstorming. So this is the very, very first thing you do when you get a motion. And before I talk about anything on the side, obviously there are some key things you need to remember. I discussed about motion types last time during the last workshop. So there's obviously something you can start with, thinking about the motion type and what this means in terms of what you need to argue, generally coming up with thoughts and everything. So the first thing I usually think about is what is the problem in this debate. Sometimes it can be quite intuitive, like in this motion, this House would give citizens more votes based on their preference on a test of current affairs and general politics knowledge. I think in this motion, the problem is quite obvious. We're probably talking about people's voting behaviors. Do we have too much populism? Are people making uneducated choices? So in this motion, thinking about the problem is quite obvious. However, in some other motions, especially if they're not a this House would motion, thinking of the problem can actually be really useful for coming up with ideas on how the debate is going to go and what kind of arguments to make. So for example, in a motion, this House supports the trend of long-term romantic couples living apart, i.e. in separate residential addresses or in separate apartments. It might not be super obvious what the problem is at first. Is the problem that people live together as it is, or is it a problem of how this then affects their relationship? Or why is this something that we are talking about in this motion? I think asking the question why this motion was set, what is the problem that we are trying to discuss here, is a good way to go forward of it. Because otherwise, if you just go into talking about are 2 houses better than 1 house, you might miss the actual crux of the debate, which probably also talks about things such as romance or relationships or the way individual people feel about the relationships. The second thing I always think about when I get a motion is I actually usually start thinking about the other side before I go to my own arguments. So for example, if I get a motion, I tend to first be like, okay, what would opposition argue on this side? And then like do that for like 30 seconds, 1 minute. And then I think about my own things, because then I can make sure that they are clashing with the most obvious points I think that opposition is going to do. Great example of this, what would happen if you don't do this. This is a motion I debated with one of my partners. This House would heavily tax high-intensity animal farming. We were in opening government and we were a bit unsure as to how this debate is going to play out. So we made a big, beautiful case as two vegans at the time, thinking about why high intensity animal farming is really, really bad and how taxing is going to reduce that or is going to change that. And we had lots of arguments on why high intensity animal farming is bad. However, then opening opposition stood up and made a case about how they completely agree with high intensity animal farming being bad and just proposed an alternative solution. That was a situation in which we did not think through what the opposition case was going to be, and therefore our own material became quite irrelevant after the first speech. So always great to think about the opposition case in advance to make sure your arguments are clashing. And third thing, what is it that you need to prove to win / what is going to be the most contentious issue in this debate? And this is quite dependent on motion types, as I discussed last time, things such as this house as a individual, as a country. In that motion, you probably think more about like what are the interests of the individual or the organization in question, or if it is this house would, how is it going to solve the problem? There are generally three things of what can be the most contentious. So the first one is framing, or where the debate takes place. Is it going to be a question on how the world looks like, how, for example, in social movements debates, how are social movements received within the wider society? This is something that generally becomes very, very contentious in such motions. Therefore, probably you have to think about that a lot during your brainstorm or when you're coming up with arguments for your case. Second thing is the mechanization on how to best reach the impacts. For example, if you have a lot of feminist motions, then in those debates, oftentimes both sides agree with the goal. They agree that the goal is, I don't know, reaching equality, reaching that women are equally included in our everyday life, we're given equal opportunities, and usually the debate then is what is the best mechanism to reach that goal. So generally then you have to do a lot of robust work in terms of why your mechanism is the thing that is winning this debate. And then the third thing is the impacts or weighing between the arguments. I would say that this happens often in kinds of, for example, criminal justice motions, or when you have to do any kind of principled debates, or when you have to weigh off two very different outcomes, then presumably it matters less on how great the arguments are, but it matters more what the impact of those arguments are and how you compare it to the other side. For example, if you're forced to compare future generations and current generations and make a choice between them, probably these are the impacts of your arguments, but you need to focus your effort on which impact is more important, and therefore something to focus on in brainstorm. So these are just a couple of things to think about in brainstorm to make sure you're hitting the actual crux of the debate. From there onwards, if you have discussed this with your partner, or when you're like coming up with arguments and thinking what are the potential arguments, and now that you know where you should focus your attention, here are a couple of ideas. So I would say the first thing obviously is just generally writing down any idea that you get about the motion, but sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes you don't get all of the necessary ideas out of it. So a couple of things. Firstly, I would say a wish list. So essentially, what are all of the things I would like to prove? If you get a motion, you can just ask yourself a question, or be like, okay, what would be the best thing if I could prove in this debate? Or like, what are all of the different things I want to prove? It even might be something that is really hard to achieve, or like, I would like to prove that this is principally or morally wrong, or I would like to prove that this helps the most vulnerable in our communities. If you just write down things that you would like to prove within this motion, then you can later work on making that into arguments and coming up with how to do that. Sometimes coming up with the argument later is a lot easier if you already have an end goal in mind. So this is something to try if you're struggling to come up with the mechanizations of arguments or how something would happen. The second thing is, probably you've heard of this, but just pointing it out, is stakeholders. So essentially thinking about all of the groups that are affected by this motion. In some debates, usually we tend to stick with very obvious groups of people. But for example, in the motion I gave before about the trend of romantic couples living apart, presumably most people are going to think about relationships and the two people, maybe financial or economic things. But maybe you did not think about the group of parents. Maybe you did not think about the group of friends and people around us. or maybe you forgot to think about the group of children being affected by this. So if you go through stakeholder by stakeholder, who are everyone that is going to be affected by this motion, then presumably you're going to find a new angle on where to come up with certain arguments. And for example, make an argument that, living apart, probably really bad for the family, or conversely, maybe really good for the family. And third thing is flipping opposition arguments. So as I said in the beginning, it might sometimes be a great idea to start thinking about what are the most likely things that opposition is going to argue. You can do this in two ways. Firstly, if opposition argues that something is a harm, you can say that actually that's not harm, that is a benefit. So kind of doing an even if, like even if that's true, that's not a bad thing, that's rather a good thing. Or conversely, if opposition says something is a benefit, you can say that is actually a harm. Or alternatively, using a logic that you can think of in an opposition argument to reach a different conclusion. You say, okay, probably they're correct that these and these things are going to happen. However, the outcome is completely different, or the reception to it is completely different than what opposition claims. So for example, especially I think in criminal justice motions, this is quite easy to flip the opposition benefits. An argument could be, this House will prosecute all attempted and committed crimes equally. An opposition team could argue that this probably means that more people are going to go to jail for a longer time, and this is really bad, and it hurts these groups of people, and maybe they're not going to get rehabilitated. On the other side, you can be like, okay, probably it is true that more people are going to go into prison. You can always obviously contest that part as well. But if you want to use this argument, you can be like, okay, more people are going to go to prison. How could that be, a good thing? And you can probably make an argument here out of the sense of justice that generally the average person feels when they know that even if someone who attempted to commit a crime is also put away in prison, it gives some sense of justice to people. This later on makes them, I don't know, report crimes more or enjoy their life more. And this is a good thing. Obviously, this is a very simplified version of a criminal justice motion. And if you do this, you obviously cannot be as insensitive in your language as I am right now. But this is just an idea on how you can take the logic and be like, okay, this leads to a different conclusion, or this harm that they're trying to prove isn't necessarily as bad as it seems to be. If you've come up now with all of these different argument ideas on going through the stakeholders, doing the wish list, thinking about the opposition, then it's the time where you turn to the case details. How are you putting together this case, and all of the details of it? So probably the first thing you want to do is pick out the arguments. Ideally, in a prep time, you come up with more arguments than you can fit into your case. You have like maybe 4 or 5 argument ideas. The goal is to always pick the strongest and the most important points, because especially if you're in top half, you probably can't make 7 different arguments super convincingly. You can either see if you can combine some of them, or you have to choose the best arguments, because simply otherwise you don't have enough time to make all arguments very strong and unbeatable. The next thing you probably do is you have to think about what framing or characterization do I need. So how does the world have to look like for my arguments to have maximum success? So for example, especially in social movements debates, this is very common, where you have to be like, in order to make your point, you either have to characterize the world as, or the world that we're living in is very, very open to social movements, quite an open world. More people are feminists, more people believe in Black Lives Matter, or alternatively, you can characterize the world as something that is quite hostile to social movements. There is still a lot of institutional, structural racism within our society, and therefore receptiveness to movements such as Black Lives Matter or feminism is still quite bad. These are both plausible characterizations, but in that motion, when you know what you want to argue, you have to pick the kind of characterization and framing that best suits your case. And thirdly, you gotta come up with a plan if the motion calls for a plan. Generally, good thing to think about then is, what is the absolute minimum I need to put in my plan to make, to have all of the necessary details in place, like how specific do I need to be for this plan to work, and they can't point out any obvious loopholes. And at the same time, what is the maximum possible amount I can design or craft this plan, or how far can I go with this plan without giving opposition too much fiat power to come up with an alternative plan that might actually be better than what the motion set out to be. So thinking through the details of the plan. And then lastly, looking at the detailed mechanization of arguments. what I usually do, or what I used to do with my partner, is basically coming up with a laundry list of reasons why something is true. So I would literally sit down and be like, okay, we want to prove that, you know, we have X, it turns to Y. What are the reasons for it? And we're like, okay, let's come up with 5 reasons why this is true. And usually some are stronger than others, but it makes your argument significantly more robust if you have 5 reasons why something is true. This is also true for impacts. If you have 3 different impacts that stem from the same mechanization or stem from the same argument, then this is usually something that makes your arguments a lot harder to take down. Because even if some of those reasons are quite stupid or, you know, quite easy to take down, if the opposition has to spend a lot more time on taking down 5 mechanisms rather than 1, then it's much more likely that you can later on go and stand up, be like, okay, they answered to 2 of our mechanisms, but there are still 3 others that we talked about, therefore this argument still stands. So this is something that is really crucial. I don't really have a good tip on how to do this. Just take the time and think for a bit of time what are alternative reasons why something might be true, just trying to come up with this. Lastly, detailed case making. Always, always, always think about impacts and weighing. Think about why your reasons are the most important, why your impacts are the most important in this debate. The way to do it is essentially treating them like an argument, thinking of like, okay, why is it true that being happy is the most important thing in the world, or people's lives improve? Why is that the best thing, or why is it more important than whatever opposition is trying to argue? Treat that as a separate argument, and with this you can come up with the specific case details. Okay, before I go to that, so this is essentially how I would say that how most of prep time goes. So the first parts are spent on brainstorm and argument generation, and then you do all of this detailed work. Usually the detailed work depends a lot on if you're the first speaker or if you're the second speaker, because generally, well, at least we used to do in our partnership, is that whoever was speaking first, so either prime minister speeches or member speeches, was the person who was a lot more focused on coming up with all of the detailed mechanisms, and it was kind of a bit more their responsibility. And the second speaker at that time had time to think about the opposition case, come up with potential pieces of rebuttal you can use later on in the debate, because generally you don't have enough time to come up with the responses to all the responses during the debate. So you have that, and then later on you can also see if the case, if the opposition case is clashing with the case that you have just come up with. Obviously, we're always collaborating during that final time of coming up with the, you know, the details, and both members should know what the exact, you know, arguments are and what the case is. However, there's a lot of, you know, job allocation that you can do within those last couple of minutes, allow someone to write their speech, etc. So this is how I would say I would go about prep time normally. This is mostly for top half. I think back half has a couple of things to keep in mind that make it a bit more specific, make prep time more specific to it. So the first thing is always to consider what are the most obvious top half arguments. If you're in closing opposition, you really need to be quite clear or have a great understanding of what are the most likely arguments that your opening opposition team is going to make, because you are going to be needing an extension. So essentially, try to picture how the debate will proceed. What this will help you with is guessing what will the opening half team do badly, because probably they only have 14 minutes. They need to do responses, they need to build up their case. This means that it's unlikely that they're going to do all of the mechanization great, they're going to do all the characterization great, the impact, the weighing. Usually, if you think about the obvious arguments, it's quite easy to see where are going to be the weaker parts. So this is a great place where you can focus your energy and come up, for example, with alternative mechanisms, or you can come up with alternative impacts, or just be very clear on what the characterization of the debate is. Because if you can bring that when your opening did not, and it's debate changing, you can already win the debate with that. Or weighing is quite an easy way to go about it too, I would say, because most often, especially if you're in top half, many people put less effort into weighing their debates, and then it kind of leaves opening half in a deadlock in kind of a way where one team says one thing, other team says other thing, and then no one weighs those 2 impacts. If you do that in closing half, you can be very successful with that. And third thing is to come up with great responses to your opposing team. Especially if you think you have a very strong opening team, it is probably going to be very hard to come up with a winning extension. That if you extensively think through what the opposition case is going to be and how you can respond to all of those things during your prep time, then it's much more likely that you can take a strategic second, or you're very prepared to engage with all of the other teams in the debate and therefore prop up your position like that. So in back half, what I generally used to do with my partner was not necessarily use the structure that I gave before, but rather we used to do long brainstorm for several minutes, because you don't have to do things like, you know, making a plan or doing characterization as much, because generally this is done by opening teams. And in that situation, we were just discussing different possible extensions, writing them down, coming up with arguments, new mechanisms, all of that. So generally in back half, used a lot more of it to do things such as brainstorming, argument generation, lots of the things that I talked about earlier. As a last thing, moving on from prep time, is note taking, as this is another thing you can improve for yourself in order to make your debating easier. First thing I would say that this is entirely up to personal preference. These are some ideas that have helped me, or I know that have helped other people with it, but essentially note taking, I encourage you, especially if you're starting out, try a couple of different ways to do notes, or see what works for you, and then figure out how is the best way to do it. You don't have to stick to however your debate club taught you to, I don't know, fold your papers or anything. Feel free to try out whatever works best for you. So for example, and second thing to keep in mind is that it is position dependent. For example, I used to be a second speaker. When I was a second speaker, then my note taking was slightly different when I was a whip speaker versus when I was like a DPM or a DLO speaker in top half. So it depends on the position, and especially if I'm a prime minister, obviously my note taking is going to be vastly different than if I ever speak a whip speech. So this is also something to keep in mind. A couple of things. Firstly, if you're in a position, in a first speech, probably more detailed mechanisms. In second speeches, you want to have more responses. So what are the things to keep in mind? Firstly, clearly marking who said what. In BP debating, it's really important that you are quite precise on which teams you are beating. So it is great to write down not just that opposition made this claim and we are taking it down, but be like, opening opposition said this, and closing opposition said this. This is how our case interacts with them, and also your opening half team, of course, if you're speaking in second half. So this is something that I found it really useful to not just write down opset, but rather the team. Makes you a lot more clear on how you're directly engaging with both of your opposing teams. Second thing, use visual structuring. What this means is, for example, I used to debate on tiny A5 papers and just have a bunch of papers, because for me it was really helpful to have one idea or one argument kind of per one paper. And so then I just had a bunch of different papers, and it allowed me the space to write in and write all of that. Some people I know, they like having one visual overview of how the debate is proceeding, draw like a cross there, and then fill out the different areas of who writes what, because this gives them an overview of how the debate is going. Some people like having a separate rebuttal sheet. This is personal to you, but make sure that the way you structure your papers and the papers that you are using are helping you in visually structuring your speech. Because if I had just like, I knew I was going to have 3 different points in my speech, I could just neatly stack up my little A5s on top of each other in 3 piles. And that already made my speech super clear, because when I was going through the papers and going, top to bottom on the papers, then I just knew I was done talking with a point. I could move on to the new piles. So really helped me with structure there. Other thing, pens, using colorful pens or stuff like that can really be helpful for you if this is something that is visually aiding you. Or for example, I used to write positions in different colors to make sure I noticed that this is not my own material. Or if some other team said something, I would write opening opposition and then write their argument in pink. And I always took a separate pen for writing down like comparisons and weighing, because I was struggling with not doing that enough. So if I took another pen, I just made sure that I write something on every page with it, to make sure to force myself basically to practice doing better impacting and weighing. So just use that small thing to make myself do that. Another thing helpful for note taking, how you can improve your speeches. And last thing is preparing papers in prep time. This is mostly for second speakers, but what I used to do is when I knew my partner was going to make 2 arguments, then I usually just wrote, had one paper with one of her arguments and another paper with the second argument I knew she was going to make. I had briefly like the mechanisms written down in like 1 sentence, and then I could just write whatever the other team was responding on it. I did that in prep time, so I don't have to spend time during the debate with like, coming up with structures or coming up with what my partner said, but rather, I have that ready to go, and I can just write down whatever someone else says, and it's easy to go. So this is another thing to try maybe, or practice, can be helpful for you during the debate. So you spend more time on actively listening and less time on trying to decide on what the structure of your speech is going to be. I think this is it. So hopefully I'm in time. If you do have any questions about any of the things that I talked about, argument generation, prep time, anything like that, feel free to use your microphone or write in the chat. If there are no questions, then thank you very much for listening to me. I hope you have an entertaining debate after this one. But from my side, thank you very much.